The morning Lillian Maddox walked through the iron gate of the Sheridan ranch. Calvin Sheridan stood 10 feet away with a branding iron in his hand, a half-formed thought on his tongue, and not a single syllable of his own name left anywhere inside his head. It happened just like that. One moment he was Calvin Sheridan, the most feared and respected rancher in all of New Mexico territory, a man who had stared down drought, cattle thieves, Apache raids, and the relentless cruelty of the Chihuahuan desert without blinking once. The next moment, the gate creaked open and she stepped through it, and the name his mother had given him, the name his father had carved into a fence post the day he was born, simply evaporated like morning dew off a cactus spine. He would not fully understand what had happened to him until much later. That morning, standing in the pale gold light of the New Mexico sunrise in the year of our Lord 1873, he only knew that something had changed. Something had shifted deep in the bedrock of who he was, and the world would never look quite the same as it had the day before. Lillian Maddox was 26 years old, though the hardships of the last 2 years had tried their considerable best to age her further. She was tall for a woman of her era, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up under a wide-brimmed traveling hat that had seen better days. Her dress was the color of sage, faded at the elbows and hem from long use, and she carried a single leather traveling bag in her right hand and a folded letter in her left. Her jaw was set with a kind of determination that people acquire only through genuine suffering, and her green eyes moved across the ranch yard with the careful, measuring look of a woman who had learned not to trust anything too quickly. Calvin Sheridan was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and weathered in the way that New Mexico weather everything eventually, with fine lines at the corners of his dark eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that jutted out of the hills behind his property. He was not a handsome man in any conventional or polished sense of the word. He was the kind of man whose face made sense only outdoors, in strong light, doing hard work. He had not shaved in 4 days. His shirt had a burn mark on the left cuff from an incident with a cookfire the week prior. His boots were caked with the honest evidence of ranch labor. He stood there, branding iron still in his hand, and watched her come through the gate like a woman who had every right to be there. And for the life of him, he could not have told you his own name if the territorial governor himself had demanded it. She stopped a few feet in front of him and looked him directly in the eyes without flinching, which already distinguished her from approximately 80% of the men who had ever stood where she was standing. "I am looking for Calvin Sheridan," she said. Her voice was steady, with a faint trace of a Missouri accent that had been worn smooth by travel. "I was told in town that this is his property." He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Behind him, somewhere near the barn, his ranch hand Domingo Vega let out a short laugh that he quickly converted into a cough. "That is him," Domingo called out helpfully, not troubling himself to come any closer. "He is just surprised to see a lady is all." Calvin set the branding iron down against the fence post beside him with a deliberateness that was mostly an attempt to recover some dignity. He pulled off his hat, which was the courteous thing to do, and squinted slightly against the morning sun now that his brim was no longer shading his eyes. "I am Calvin Sheridan," he said, and it came out sounding slightly experimental, as though he were testing whether the name still fit. "What can I do for you?" She unfolded the letter she had been carrying and held it out toward him. "My name is Lillian Maddox. I wrote to you 6 weeks ago regarding the advertisement you placed in the Santa Fe New Mexican. I have come about the position of housekeeper and cook." Calvin took the letter from her and looked at it, though he had already read it twice when it first arrived and had not responded to it, which was something he would need to explain in the next few moments. He had placed the advertisement, that much was true. He had placed it in a moment of genuine desperation after his previous housekeeper, a formidable widow named Mrs. Aragon, had departed to live with her daughter in El Paso. The ranch house had been sliding steadily toward chaos in the 3 months since. He had interviewed 2 other women from the territory, both of whom had taken one look at the isolated ranch, the sparse furnishings, the distance from town, and the general air of masculine disorder that had settled over everything, and had politely declined. When Lillian's letter had arrived, written in a precise and confident hand, he had read it and thought that she sounded capable and serious. He had then been overtaken by the branding season, 3 escaped cattle, a dispute with his neighbor Frank Holloway over a water rights agreement, and a week of his ranch foreman being laid up with a broken collarbone, and he had simply not written back. "I did not respond to your letter," he said, because there was no graceful way around it. "No," she agreed, "you did not. I apologize for that. It was poor manners." "It was," she said, without particular heat, just as a statement of fact. He looked at her again. She had traveled, he calculated, somewhere between 200 and 300 miles to stand in front of him. The leather of her traveling bag was worn thin at the handles. Her hat had lost its original shape. She was standing very straight, which he suspected cost her some effort after however long she had been traveling. "How did you get here from Santa Fe?" he asked. "Staged to Las Cruces, then hired a wagon north to Mescalero, then rode in on the mail carrier's horse for the last 12 miles because there was no other conveyance available." She said it plainly, without complaint, as though she were simply recounting the weather. Behind him, Domingo had given up pretending not to listen, and was now leaning openly against the barn door with his arms crossed and an expression of great interest on his face. "You rode 12 miles on a mail carrier's horse," Calvin said. "He was a very reasonable horse." Something moved in Calvin's chest. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He identified it several seconds later as the beginning of admiration. "Come inside," he said. "I will put some coffee on and we can talk." The ranch house was a substantial adobe structure with thick walls that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter, which was the best thing that could be said about it in its current state. The kitchen was serviceable but in disorder. The main room had too many pieces of saddle equipment draped over the furniture, and a fine layer of dust on every horizontal surface. The windows were clean, which was the one domestic virtue Calvin had maintained, because he could not abide dirty windows. Lillian walked through the main room with that same careful, measuring gaze she had turned on the yard, noting everything without commenting on any of it. Calvin moved to the kitchen and began building up the fire in the stove, which gave him something to do with his hands. "How long has it been since the last housekeeper left?" she asked from the main room. 3 months and some days," he called back. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The advertisement said the position included room and board. Is there a suitable room?" "There is a room off the back of the house. It has its own door to the yard. It is private." He said this last word with some emphasis because he wanted her to understand that he was not the sort of man who would make her uncomfortable in her own sleeping quarters. He had a mother and 2 sisters somewhere back in Texas, and they had raised him to be a decent man, or at least they had tried. She nodded. "What are the duties?" "Cooking, cleaning, general management of the household." "My men eat the morning and evening meals here at the house. There are 4 of them. Domingo Vega is my foreman now that Hector is laid up. Then there is Miguel, Samuel, and a young man named Thomas who came on 3 weeks ago. Thomas is 19 and fairly useless, but he has a good heart and he is learning." A ghost of something crossed her face. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape one makes right before a smile appears. "What are you paying?" $15 a month plus room and board." She considered this. In 1873, $15 was reasonable for the work, though not extravagant. "I accept," she said. He turned from the stove and looked at her directly. "Do you not want to see the room first?" "Yes," she said, "but I would have accepted regardless. I do not have the luxury of being particular at the moment." That honesty hit him square in the chest. There was something so unguarded about it, so unlike the careful social performances most people conducted, that it disarmed him completely. He stood there looking at her for a moment that went a beat too long. "I will show you the room," he said. She settled in by noon. He did not know what she had expected the room to look like, but she made no complaint about its plainness. By 2 in the afternoon, she had gone through the main room and the kitchen with a systematic thoroughness that made Calvin feel simultaneously grateful and slightly ashamed of himself. She found his cleaning rags, which were behind a barrel in the storeroom, and she found where his previous housekeeper had kept the soap, and she found a broom that had fallen behind the sideboard and apparently been forgotten. When Calvin came in from the afternoon's work at 5:30, the main room looked like a room that people lived in rather than a room that ranch equipment was being stored in. The kitchen smelled of something cooking, something that involved onions and dried chilies and the haunting, warm scent of fresh bread. The table was set with the good plates, which Calvin had not seen since Mrs. Aragon's departure. Domingo walked in behind him, pushed the brim of his hat up with one finger and looked around the room with open appreciation. "She has been here half a day," he said quietly. "Yes," Calvin agreed. "This is already better than it has been in 3 months." "Yes," Calvin agreed again. "You should not have waited so long to respond to her letter." Calvin gave him a look that Domingo returned with perfect serenity, as he was one of those men who was entirely comfortable being looked at disapprovingly by his employer. Lillian came from the kitchen with a large pot and set it on the table, and the 4 ranch hands who had gathered near the door came in and found their seats with the slightly awkward courtesy of men who were unaccustomed to having a woman at the table and were trying to remember their manners all at once. Thomas, who was 19 and given to blushing, turned a remarkable shade of red when Lillian addressed him directly and asked whether he took salt in his stew. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. "Thank you, ma'am." Calvin sat at the head of the table where he always sat and watched Lillian serve his men and pour coffee and slice the bread she had made, and felt something strange and persistent happening somewhere behind his sternum. It was not a comfortable feeling. He had been alone, in the true sense of being without companionship that reached below the surface of things, for a long time. He had built something out of that solitude. He had built the ranch, and the reputation that went with it, and a whole architecture of self-sufficiency that he now realized, obscurely proud of and also deeply tired of in equal measure. He did not say any of this at supper. He asked Lillian whether she had eaten, and she said she had earlier while she was cooking. He nodded and went back to his stew, which was the best thing he had eaten in 3 months, and tried not to be obvious about the fact that he kept looking at her. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself. Lillian rose before anyone else and had coffee made by the time Calvin came in from his first check on the horses, which he did every morning at first light out of a habit so old he could not remember acquiring it. They would stand in the kitchen in the early quiet before the ranch hands were up and drink their coffee, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both kinds of mornings were comfortable in their different ways. He learned things about her, piece by piece, the way you learn the layout of unfamiliar country, gradually, through direct experience. She was from St. Joseph, Missouri, originally, where her father had run a dry goods store. She had come west 2 years ago with her husband, a man named George Maddox, who had had ambitions about starting a farm in the New Mexico territory. George Maddox had died of typhoid fever 14 months ago in the town of Tucumcari. 3 weeks after they had arrived at the property, he had purchased sight unseen, which turned out to be not what he had been led to believe it was, and which she had subsequently been forced to sell for a fraction of what it had cost them, in order to pay the debts George had left behind him. She told him this on a Tuesday morning, quietly, over coffee, without self-pity, in the same tone she might have used to describe a long but unremarkable journey. When she was finished, she picked up her coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the mountains, and he looked at the side of her face and felt a rage on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity. "I am sorry," he said, "about your husband and about all the rest of it." She turned back from the window. "Thank you," she said simply. "You managed it, though," he said. "You found your way through." "I have not found my way through yet," she said. "I am still in the middle of finding it." She looked at him steadily. "But I will." He believed her completely. He had been assessing people his whole life, out of necessity, the way a rancher must assess the country and the weather and the men he hires, and he had become very good at knowing which people had genuine substance and which people only appeared to. Lillian Maddox had substance. She had it the way good timber does, all the way down to the center, with no soft places or hollow spots. He thought about her at unexpected times throughout the day. He would be mending a fence line or working a young horse or going over his account books, and some detail of her would surface in his mind uninvited. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she laughed, which she did not do frequently but which, when it happened, was genuine and warm and came from somewhere real. The way she had looked at him that first morning through the gate, with those green eyes that missed nothing and apologized for nothing. He was not a man who usually noticed such things, or at least he had not been. He wondered, sometimes, in the evenings when the ranch was quiet, and he was sitting on the porch watching the sky change color over the mountains, whether he had simply stopped noticing them at some point, or whether there had never been anyone quite worth noticing them about before. Domingo noticed that Calvin was distracted in ways he had not previously been distracted. Domingo noticed most things, having spent 12 years working alongside Calvin Sheridan and developing a comprehensive understanding of his moods and habits. He said nothing about it for 10 days, which was patient even by his standards. On the 11th day, he and Calvin were working together repairing the north fence line, a job that required enough physical labor to make conversation natural but not so much that it precluded it, and Domingo said, without preamble and without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "She is a good woman." Calvin hammered a staple into the post. "Yes," he said. "A strong woman, yes. The kind of woman," Domingo continued in the same easy conversational tone, "that a man would be very foolish to let walk out of his life once he had found her." Calvin looked at him. Domingo went on stretching wire. "Are you finished?" Calvin asked. "I am not sure," Domingo said thoughtfully. "I think I may have 1 or 2 more observations." "Save them," Calvin said, and went back to his hammering, and Domingo smiled at the fence post and said nothing else, which was the wisest thing he had done all week. The trouble with Frank Holloway came to a head on a Friday afternoon in late October, when Holloway's men began cutting the irrigation ditch that fed water to the north pasture of the Sheridan Ranch. It was an old dispute, going back to an agreement made between Calvin's father and Holloway's father in the 1860s, an agreement that had never been written down properly, and that both families now interpreted differently. The water rights to the small creek that ran through both properties had been a point of tension for years, but Holloway, who had recently sold a portion of his land to a mining company and was feeling financially confident, had decided to push the matter. Calvin rode out to the north fence line with Domingo when word came from Samuel about what Holloway's men were doing. He found 3 of Holloway's cowboys with shovels and picks, rerouting the ditch in a direction that would starve his north pasture of water before the winter. He rode up to them and stopped his horse and looked at them for a long moment. "Get off my land," he said, "and fill that ditch back in before you leave." The older of the 3 men, one Calvin recognized as Holloway's ranch foreman, a man named Peters, looked back at him with the studied indifference of someone who has been told he has the law on his side. "Mr. Holloway has a legal right to this water. His lawyer says so." "Mr. Holloway's lawyer says a great many things," Calvin replied. "What he does not have is a judge's order, which is what would be required before any work was done on this land. Until there is such an order, you are trespassing. Fill in the ditch and leave." The confrontation did not escalate beyond hard words, because Calvin's reputation in the territory was such that even men acting on someone else's orders thought carefully before pushing him physically. Peters and his men filled in the ditch and left, but the situation was not resolved. Calvin knew that Holloway would not let it go, and that at some point he would need to engage a lawyer himself and go before a judge in Las Cruces to settle the matter properly. He came home that evening later than usual, dusty and tired, and carrying the particular heaviness that comes from fighting battles that have no clean resolution, only managed distances. He unsaddled his horse and rubbed him down and came into the house, and the smell of supper hit him first, and then the sound of Lillian's voice. She was reading aloud to young Thomas, who had broken his hand that afternoon when a horse had stepped on it, and who was sitting at the kitchen table with his hand wrapped, and his face still pale from the pain. She was reading from a book of frontier stories, her voice doing different voices for different characters in a way that was both unself-conscious and quietly theatrical, and Thomas was watching her with the rapt attention of someone who has never had much read to him and has just discovered what he has been missing. Calvin stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment before either of them noticed him. Something in his chest turned over slowly and completely, like a stone being turned in a stream, revealing the softer surface that had been hidden from the water. Lillian looked up and saw him, and her voice stopped. "Sit down," she said. "Supper is staying warm. I will get you a plate." "How is the hand?" Calvin asked Thomas. "It hurts considerable," Thomas admitted. "But Miss Lillian says it will heal clean if I rest it." "Miss Lillian is right," Calvin said. He sat down at the table and accepted the plate she brought him and ate, and listened to her read another 2 pages of the frontier story to Thomas, and felt the heaviness of the afternoon beginning to lift off him increment by increment, like clouds clearing off a mountain. He thought, that night, lying in his bed in the dark with the desert quiet pressing in through the windows, that this was dangerous. Not in the way that droughts and cattle thieves and water disputes were dangerous, not in ways he knew how to defend against, but in a softer and therefore more perilous way. He was getting used to her. He was getting used to the rhythm of her presence in his house, the particular way she moved through the space, the way the house felt differently when she was in it versus when it had been empty, the way those early morning coffees had become the thing he most looked forward to about any given day. Getting used to someone, he knew, was how you got hurt. You built your life around their presence without even noticing you were doing it, and then when they were gone, the architecture that remained made no sense. He resolved in the dark to be more careful, to maintain the appropriate distance between employer and employee, to be decent and respectful and nothing more. He was quite firm about this, in the dark, alone. The next morning, she was standing at the kitchen stove when he came in, her dark auburn hair still loose around her shoulders because she had not yet put it up, and she turned and handed him his coffee before he had even reached the table, because she had learned exactly how long it took him to come from the barn to the kitchen, and had timed the pouring accordingly. And she said, "I think your horse was favoring his left front this morning when I saw him in the yard. You might want to have a look before you ride out." And all of his careful nocturnal resolve was approximately as useful as a paper fence in a rainstorm. He noticed that she avoided talking about herself during those morning conversations. She was genuinely interested in him, in the ranch, in the country, in the history of the territory, and she asked good questions and listened to the answers with real attention. But she redirected her own story with a subtlety that he recognized because he was skilled at the same technique himself. He was a man who had been keeping his interior life private for so long that the habit had calcified into instinct, and he recognized it immediately in another person when he saw it. He began, carefully and without making a production of it, to ask her things. Small things, initially. Whether she had enjoyed reading as a girl, what the winters were like in Missouri compared to New Mexico, whether she had traveled anywhere before coming west. She answered these questions readily enough because they were surface questions and she was accustomed to managing those. But over days and then weeks, he moved the questions gradually deeper, the way you ease a nervous horse toward a thing it is afraid of, slowly and with patience, letting it find its own way to trust. One morning in November, with frost on the ground outside and the fire built high in the kitchen stove, she told him about the child she and George had lost before they came west. A boy born too early who had lived 3 days. She told him this quietly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, looking at the table rather than at him. He said nothing. He knew that sometimes the right response to a thing that has no adequate response is simply to stay present and not look away, and so he did not look away, and after a while she looked up and found him still there, watching her without pity and without discomfort, just steady and present, and something shifted between them in that moment that neither of them had words for yet. "I have never told anyone about him out here," she said. "In the territory, I mean." "Why did you tell me?" he asked. She thought about this honestly. "Because you do not treat difficult things as though they ought to be hidden away," she said. He turned that over in his mind. "I have had enough difficult things that I ran out of places to hide them," he said. She smiled at that, a full and real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and changed the whole light of her face. And Calvin Sheridan, who had once stared down a mountain lion from a distance of 15 feet without his pulse rising appreciably, felt his heart knock against his ribs like a boot heel on a wooden floor. He told her, in return, about his father. About how Calvin Sheridan Sr. had built the ranch from a single section of scrubby land in 1855, and had worked himself into his grave doing it, dying at 53 of heart failure, and how Calvin had been 20 years old when it happened, and had stepped into a situation that most people expected to collapse within a year, and had instead turned it into the most successful cattle operation in that part of the territory. He had never talked about that time in any detail with anyone, not even Domingo, who had been there for most of it. He told Lillian the shape of it, the fear that had lived with him through those early years, the almost physical weight of responsibility, the loneliness of being the person others looked to when they themselves were afraid. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "How old were you when you stopped being afraid?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am not sure I did," he said finally. "I think I just got better at working while afraid." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "That is what most capable people are, I think," she said. "Just people who have gotten very good at continuing to work while afraid." He thought about that for most of the day. He thought about it while he was working cattle, and while he was going over his account books, and while he was mending tack in the late afternoon. He thought it was probably the most precise and compassionate description of competence he had ever heard. The Holloway situation grew complicated in December. Calvin had engaged a lawyer in Las Cruces named Robert Alcott, who was not cheap, but who was reputed to be the best land and water rights attorney in the territory. Alcott reviewed the old agreement between the two families and confirmed that Calvin was correct in his interpretation, but also confirmed that, without written records predating Holloway's claim, the case would require time and considerable expense to settle. Then Holloway did something that changed the nature of the dispute. He offered to settle the water rights issue privately, outside of court, in exchange for Calvin selling him the North 40 acres of the Sheridan property. The North 40 were not the most productive acres Calvin owned, but they sat directly above the aquifer that fed both properties' wells, and selling them to Holloway would give Holloway effective control of the water for the entire range. Calvin brought the letter containing Holloway's offer into the kitchen one evening after supper, when the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Lillian was washing the dishes. He sat down at the table and read it again, which he had already done 4 times, and then set it down. Lillian dried her hands on her apron and looked at his face. "What is it?" He slid the letter toward her and she read it. Her green eyes moved steadily across the page. When she finished, she set it down and stood thinking for a moment. "He knows you will not sell," she said. "Then why offer? To see if the legal battle has worn you down enough to make you consider it," she said, "and to establish in his own mind and perhaps in others that he made a reasonable offer and you refused it. It positions him as the accommodating party. Calvin looked at her. He was not surprised by her intelligence. He had understood for weeks that she was sharply intelligent, but he was struck by the particular quality of her thinking, the way she moved directly to the underlying strategy without getting distracted by the surface of things. "That is exactly what it is," he said. "You will not sell. I will not sell. Then respond through your lawyer, document the refusal and its reasons, and keep the record clean." She picked the letter up and handed it back to him. "He is trying to create a narrative. You need to make sure the accurate narrative is equally well documented." He took the letter from her. Their fingers did not quite touch in the exchange, but they came close enough that he was aware of the precise distance between them. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. "From my father," she said. "He ran a business in a competitive town. He said the most important thing in any dispute was to understand what the other person was actually after, because it was usually not the thing they said they were after." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said, and the past tense lay there gently, and Calvin understood that her father too was gone, and added that to the catalogue of losses she carried with such composure. He wrote back to Holloway through Alcott, clearly and firmly declining the offer and documenting his reasons, exactly as Lillian had advised. Alcott was pleased with the letter's strategic content and said so, which gave Calvin a satisfaction he might not have been able to fully account for if pressed. Christmas came to the Sheridan ranch in a way it had not come in several years. Lillian made a proper meal, a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and a cornbread dressing, and a dried apple pie that made Thomas, who was from a family in Tennessee and had not had apple pie since he was 14 years old, very nearly weep with gratitude. She had found a piece of pine bough somewhere and put it in a tin can on the kitchen table with a red ribbon around it, which was a small and simple thing, but which made the table look festive, and somehow made the room feel inhabited in the way that rooms can feel inhabited only when someone genuinely cares for them. Calvin had gotten her a gift. He had ordered it from a catalog 5 weeks prior with a degree of deliberation that was disproportionate to the simplicity of the item itself. It was a good quality wool shawl in a dark green that he had correctly calculated would suit her coloring. He gave it to her on Christmas morning, somewhat awkwardly, holding it out to her in the kitchen while she was starting the breakfast fire. She turned from the stove and looked at the shawl and then looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he did not have precise vocabulary for. It was not surprise exactly, or not only surprise. It was something more complicated, something that involved being moved and trying not to show the full extent of it. "Thank you," she said quietly. She took the shawl and held it for a moment without putting it on. "The green seemed like it would suit you," he said, which was more personal than he had intended to say, and he was aware of it as he said it. She looked up at him. "It does," she said simply. She had gotten him a gift as well, which he had not expected. It was a journal, a good leather-bound one with thick pages, because she had noticed that he kept his records in a worn ledger book that was nearly full, and had told her once, in passing, that he had thought about keeping a proper diary, but had never managed to start one. She had found the journal in the mercantile in Mescalero on a supply run and held it aside for weeks. He held it in his hands and looked at it with an expression that she watched carefully. He ran his thumb along the spine of it, the way a person does when they are trying to express in a physical gesture what they cannot quite say. "This is very thoughtful," he said. "You have a life worth writing down," she said. "Things worth remembering." He looked at her again with that steady, dark-eyed gaze that she had learned was his way of paying full attention, the way some men nodded and some men made affirming sounds, but Calvin Sheridan simply looked at you with his entire focus concentrated in his eyes. "Happy Christmas," he said. "Happy Christmas," she said back. The winter was cold and the days were short, and there was a snowfall in January that was heavier than usual for that part of the territory, closing the road to Mescalero for 9 days and shutting the ranch in on itself. During those 9 days, the world contracted to the ranch house and the barn and the short cold distance between them, and the 5 people who occupied it were forced into a proximity that required either friction or fellowship. They chose fellowship, largely due to Lillian, who kept the evenings from being dull by organizing card games and reading aloud and drawing young Thomas into conversations about his family in Tennessee that had him talking and laughing in a way he was generally too shy to do in company. Calvin watched her do this from across the table, again and again, and thought that she had a gift for it, for the particular skill of making people feel comfortable enough to be themselves. He thought it was probably the rarest kind of social talent, rarer than wit or charm, because it required subordinating your own desire to be seen in favor of genuinely seeing the other person. On the 5th snow day, when the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse for the evening and the house was quiet, he and Lillian sat by the fire in the main room with their coffee. The fire was good and the room was warm and the snow was still falling outside, visible as a soft gray movement beyond the window. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "Not the practical facts of it. Tell me what it means to you." He looked at the fire for a moment. He was not accustomed to being asked this kind of question. He was accustomed to being asked about acreage and cattle numbers and water rights. "My father used to say that land was the only thing that honest work actually makes permanent," he said slowly. "That you could work hard at any number of things and the results could evaporate. Droughts, market collapses, bad luck. But land that you have worked and cared for, that you have understood over years, it becomes something that has your shape in it. It knows you in return." Lillian was listening with her particular stillness, the one she wore when she was genuinely absorbed. "This land knows me," he continued. "The north pasture floods a little in the spring from the creek, and I know exactly which fence posts have shifted from the soil expanding. The south hills have a draw in them that catches the afternoon wind in a particular way and makes a sound in August that I have never heard anywhere else. I know which part of the range the cattle favor in different seasons and why. I know the mountains behind this house in every kind of light." He paused. "That sounds as though I am simply describing a property I know well." "No," she said. "It sounds like you are describing a relationship." He looked at her. The firelight was moving over her face and her dark auburn hair had come partly down from its pins in the warmth, and she was looking back at him with those green eyes that held both steadiness and something warmer, something that had been building in them gradually over weeks in a way that he had been trying very hard not to acknowledge. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is." The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled, but inside it something was shifting again, the way it had shifted on the morning she walked through the gate, the way it had kept shifting in small increments ever since. "Lillian," he said and stopped. "Yes," she said, and it was not quite an answer to a question because he had not yet asked one, but it was an answer nonetheless to the question he had been trying to find the words for since October. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. "I want to be honest with you. Please," she said. "I hired you as my housekeeper," he said, "and you are an exceptional one. But I would be considerably less than honest if I told you that my reasons for wanting you to stay on this property are entirely professional." She looked at him steadily. She did not look surprised, but she looked like someone who has been waiting for a thing and is now confronting the reality of its arrival, and finding it both exactly what they expected and somehow still larger than the expectation. "I know," she said quietly. "I do not want to make your situation uncomfortable," he said. "If this is not something you want, say so plainly and it will not be mentioned again, and nothing between us will change in terms of your position here." "Calvin," she said. His name in her voice was something he felt physically, somewhere in the center of him. "I have been sitting in this chair for the last 20 minutes trying to find a reason to be sensible about this, and I am not finding very many." Something in his face changed. She had not seen that expression on him before, something open and unguarded, and a little bit vulnerable in a way that sat strangely on the face of the man who was known throughout the territory as the toughest rancher in New Mexico. "Are you finding any at all?" he asked, "One," she said. "I work for you." "That is a legitimate one," he admitted. "I thought so." She looked at the fire for a moment. "But I am also a widow of 36 months who has been managing her own affairs for a long time, and I think I am old enough to know the difference between something real and something that is simply proximity and convenience. How does this seem to you?" he asked, and the question was careful and honest, and asked in a tone that was more exposed than anything she had heard from him before. "Real," she said, and looked at him directly when she said it. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. He held it simply, his large weathered hand around hers, and looked at her with that full, steady attention, and she held his gaze, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because the fire was warm and the snow was falling, and the thing that had been building between them since October was now fully present in the room, acknowledged and resting quietly between them like something that has finally been allowed to breathe. He did not kiss her that night. He walked her to the door of her room, which was the gentlemanly thing to do, and he held her hand until the last possible moment before the door frame required him to let it go, and he said good night, and she said good night, and they looked at each other for another moment in which approximately everything that needed to be understood was communicated without words. February brought a complication in the form of a letter from the court in Las Cruces, informing Calvin that Frank Holloway had filed a formal claim to the water rights and that the matter would be heard before a judge in March. This was expected, but the timing was inconvenient, as March was the beginning of the most labor-intensive period of the ranch year, with calving season demanding constant attention. He told Lillian about it over their morning coffee, which was now an established ritual that the ranch hands understood was not to be intruded upon before 7:30. "You will need to go to Las Cruces for the hearing," she said. "Possibly twice," he said. "Alcott says it may not be resolved in one session." "I can manage the ranch house while you are gone," she said immediately, because she had been managing it without his active direction for months in any practical sense. "What I am thinking is that you should also bring documentation from your neighboring ranchers supporting your water usage history, character witnesses, not just legal ones." He nodded slowly. "Martinez to the east has used the creek cooperatively with me for 8 years, and he is well regarded in that part of the territory." "He is." "Then his testimony, even a written affidavit, would be worth more than you might expect. It is harder to contest a narrative when the community confirms it." He looked at her over his coffee cup. He had been consulting her on the Holloway situation for months now, and each time she had given him something useful, something that came from a different angle than he would have approached alone. He found himself trusting her thinking in a way he trusted very few people's thinking. "You would have made a formidable lawyer," he said. "My father thought so," she said dryly. "It was unfortunately not a profession available to me." The injustice of that sat between them plainly. It was 1874, and the New Mexico Territory offered women very little in the way of formal professional standing. Lillian Maddox, who could out-strategize most of the men in the county, was limited to the positions that were understood to be appropriate for women of her station. Calvin was aware of this in a way he had not been before he knew her, the specific frustration of watching a very capable mind constrained by structures that had nothing to do with the mind's actual capacity. "I know," he said, and the two words held more than agreement. They held acknowledgement of the whole unfair architecture of it. She looked at him, and the small, rueful smile that crossed her face was also a thank you for seeing it and saying so. He went to Las Cruces in March for the first hearing. He was gone for 5 days, and the ranch went on without him in the capable hands of Domingo and Lillian, who had established between them a working relationship of mutual respect and considerable efficiency. When he returned, the house was in order. A complicated fence repair in the east pasture had been organized and completed under Domingo's direction, and Lillian had preserved 24 jars of the early spring herbs she had been cultivating in a small kitchen garden she had established near the back door. He walked into the kitchen at the end of the 5th day and she was at the stove, and she turned when she heard his boots on the floor, and the look on her face when she saw him was something that he carried with him for a long time afterward, something warm and immediate and without any pretense at all, the look of a person who is genuinely glad to see you. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well," he said, "Alcott is good." Martinez came in person, which Alcott said he did not expect and which apparently made an impression on the judge. Holloway's lawyer argued well, but the history is on our side. When is the next session? April. Alcott believes the judge is leaning our way. Good. She turned back to the stove and stirred something, and then said, without turning around, "I am glad you are back." "So am I," he said, and meant it in more layers than the words could quite carry. He crossed the kitchen and stood behind her at the stove. He was aware of the proximity, of her awareness of the proximity. He put a hand on her shoulder, lightly, briefly, the way you would touch something you were not entirely certain you had the right to touch yet, and she turned her head and looked up at him over her shoulder. He kissed her there, beside the kitchen stove, with something burning slowly in the pot, and the evening light coming through the windows in long gold bars, and she set down her spoon and turned fully toward him, and returned the kiss with a completeness and sincerity that told him everything he needed to know about the nature of what she felt. When they stepped back from each other, she looked at him with those steady green eyes, and there was color in her face that was not from the stove's heat, and she said, very quietly, "I have been fairly sensible for a very long time." "I know," he said. "I think I have earned the right to be a little less sensible." "I think you have," he said, and he was smiling, which Domingo would later say was an expression he saw on Calvin Sheridan's face approximately as often as he saw snowfall in July, but which Lillian was beginning to see more frequently, and which suited him, she thought, in a way that nothing else quite did. Spring came in earnest, and with it, the full demanding intensity of calving season, which meant that both Calvin and his ranch hands were working from before dawn until after dark, and Lillian adapted to the new rhythm without complaint, shifting meals to different hours, keeping food warm on the stove for whenever someone came in, bandaging a cut hand here and a rope burned there, and at one point helping to pull a calf whose mother was in difficulty, which she did with a calm practicality that impressed even the experienced Domingo. "She is not a woman who is afraid of hard things," Domingo told Calvin that evening unnecessarily, since Calvin had been watching her work beside him all day and had arrived at this conclusion approximately 4 months ago. "No," Calvin agreed. "She is also not a woman who is uncertain about what she wants," Domingo continued, "which is a quality that is useful in a partner." "Domingo," Calvin said, "I am simply making an observation. Make it somewhere else." Domingo smiled and went to the bunkhouse, and Calvin went into the house, and Lillian looked up from the table where she was writing a letter, and he sat down across from her, and they talked for an hour about nothing consequential, about the calf born that afternoon and the state of the north pasture and what she was planning to plant in the kitchen garden, and by the time she said good night and went to her room, he had decided. He decided with the same directness that he decided everything, without extensive internal debate, because he had already thought about it sufficiently, and the answer was clear. He loved her. He had been in love with her for months, possibly since that first morning, when he had looked at her through the gate and lost his own name, and everything that seemed important before she appeared had rearranged itself quietly around the fact of her. He intended to ask her to marry him. He had the legal matter with Holloway still outstanding, and he wanted to wait until that was settled, partly because he did not want anything unresolved casting a shadow over the asking, and partly because he wanted to be able to offer her a future that was not entangled in uncertainty. The April hearing in Las Cruces went in his favor. The judge ruled that the water rights belonged to the Sheridan Ranch according to the original agreement and the historical usage, and that Holloway had no legal basis for his claim. Holloway was ordered to pay a portion of Calvin's legal costs. The ruling was final. Calvin rode back from Las Cruces on a clear April afternoon, with the mesquite blooming along the road, and the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted, and he felt lighter than he had felt in a very long time. The water dispute was resolved. The ranch was sound. Calving season had produced an excellent calf crop. His account books were healthy. And he was in love with a woman who, he was fairly confident, was in love with him in return, and he intended to do something about it. He came through the gate of his own ranch as the sun was getting low, and Lillian was in the kitchen garden, crouched down doing something with the seedlings she had been tending. She looked up when she heard his horse and straightened and shielded her eyes with her hand against the low sun. He dismounted and tied his horse to the post and walked toward her, and she walked toward him from the garden, and they met in the middle of the yard. "The ruling," she said, "in our favor, fully and finally." She closed her eyes for a moment and let out a breath that held 3 months of tension. "Good," she said, "good." He had planned to say this differently. He had thought about it on the road and had a sequence of words arranged in his mind that were honest and clear and properly expressed. Instead, standing in the middle of his ranch yard in the late April sun with her green eyes looking at him, he said it directly and without preamble. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to say that for some time, and I am saying it now. I love you, Lillian, and I would like to ask you to marry me." She looked at him. The evening light was in her hair and on her face, and she looked at him with an expression that was so fully open, so completely without her usual careful composure, that he could see everything in it, all the feeling she had been managing quietly for months, all of it present and visible. "Yes," she said. It came out immediately and completely and with a certainty that held nothing back. "Yes," he said, as though he wanted to be absolutely sure he had heard correctly. "Calvin Sheridan," she said, "if you make me say it a second time, I will be considerably less impressed with your intelligence." He laughed, which was also something that did not happen often enough, according to people who had known him a long time and were very pleased to see it happening now. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands and kissed her properly in the middle of the yard, in the full view of the kitchen garden and the barn and the bunkhouse and Domingo, who had appeared in the barn doorway at some point, and who stood there with his hat over his heart with an expression of deep satisfaction. They were married in June in the small church in Mescalero, which was the closest town of sufficient size to have a proper ceremony. It was not an elaborate wedding. Lillian wore a dress of deep blue that she had made herself over the previous 6 weeks, working on it in the evenings in her room. It fit her perfectly, as things tend to do when you have made them yourself to your own specifications. She carried a handful of desert flowers that Thomas had gathered that morning with a touching solemnity. Domingo stood beside Calvin and looked like a man attending the most satisfying event he had witnessed in years. The neighbors who came included the Martinez family, Eduardo and Rosa Martinez, who had known Calvin for years and who embraced Lillian with the warm directness of people who are genuinely glad to welcome someone into a community. There were perhaps 30 people in the small church, the population of the wider ranch community, and they looked at the two of them standing at the front with the particular warmth that communities direct at couples who seem right for each other in a fundamental and recognizable way. When the ceremony was done, they rode back to the ranch together, and Lillian moved her few belongings from the small room off the back to Calvin's room at the front of the house, and the ranch house settled around them both as though it had always known this was how it was supposed to be. The first year of their marriage was a working year, as any year on a ranch must be. The summer was dry but not catastrophically so. The cattle market was strong. Calvin had been looking at the possibility of expanding the herd and took Lillian through his account books to show her where the ranch stood and what the options were, treating her as the full partner in the enterprise that he considered her to be. She had opinions about the expansion that were sound and well considered, and they arrived at a plan together that was more conservative than his initial instinct but more ambitious than hers, a balance that Domingo said had the quality of two different kinds of intelligence working in combination. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the desert sky turn its extraordinary colors over the mountains, the oranges and purples that New Mexico sunsets are made of, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they were quiet, and both kinds of evenings were exactly what they were supposed to be. She started teaching Thomas to read more fluently. He was not illiterate, but his schooling had been limited and his reading was slow and effortful. She worked with him for an hour in the evenings 3 times a week with a patience that had nothing condescending in it, only a genuine interest in watching him improve. Within 3 months, he was reading the weekly newspaper cover to cover and reporting its contents at the supper table, with the enthusiasm of someone who has discovered a new window onto the world. Calvin watched her do this and thought, not for the first time, about all the ways a capable woman's capacities were constrained by the era she lived in, and about how much of her intelligence and talent went into the domestic and the immediate, which was valuable but which was also not the whole of what she had to offer. He thought about this with a mixture of gratitude that she was here and frustration on her behalf that the world did not offer her more formal avenues, and he made sure, in the day-to-day life of the ranch, to give those capacities full exercise wherever he could. She managed the ranch's accounts. She had taken over from him gradually and without formal announcement, beginning by reviewing his ledger and making a suggestion about how he was categorizing certain expenses, and progressing, over several months, to a state where she maintained the books herself and summarized them for him monthly with a clarity and precision that made his lawyer Robert Alcott, when he visited the following spring on another matter, say that she had a natural grasp of financial organization. "I could use someone like you in my office," Alcott said, which was meant as a compliment. "I have a ranch to run," Lillian said pleasantly, which was not a rejection of the compliment but a statement of the priority. Calvin caught her eye across the table, and the look they exchanged was the kind that couples develop over time, the shorthand of a shared inner life, and what it communicated in this instance was a mutual satisfaction with the exact shape of their days. Their son was born in the spring of 1875, on a Tuesday morning with the desert waking up around the ranch house, and the mockingbirds making their complicated music in the mesquite outside the bedroom window. He was a healthy boy with a good voice, which he demonstrated emphatically upon arrival. Calvin sat on the edge of the bed and held him with the careful, reverent focus of a man handling something he knows is more important than anything else he has ever handled, and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "He needs a name," Lillian said, watching Calvin's face. "Henry," Calvin said and looked up at her. "After my father, if you agree." "Henry," she said and tried the weight of it. "Henry Sheridan." She looked at her son and nodded. "Yes, he looks like a Henry." He did not especially look like anyone in particular yet, being brand new and squashed-looking in the way of new arrivals, but this was not the sort of thing anyone said in the first hour. Calvin stayed by her side for the rest of the day, which was not something the ranch strictly required of him, but which was the most natural thing he had ever done. Domingo managed the day's work with his customary competence, and told Calvin in the evening that everything was handled and he should stay where he was, which Calvin had not needed telling. Thomas came to the doorway in the afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look of profound uncertainty about the correct social behavior for this particular occasion, and Lillian called him in and let him see the baby, and told him that Henry was very glad to make his acquaintance. And Thomas looked at Henry with the same rapt attention he had once directed at the frontier stories she read to him, and said that he was the finest-looking boy he had ever seen, which was generous given the evidence available. That night, with the baby sleeping in the small crib Calvin had built 3 weeks prior from good pine he had ordered from the sawmill, and the desert quiet outside the windows, and Lillian's hand in his under the blanket, Calvin lay awake in the particular and extraordinary stillness that follows enormous things. He thought about the morning Lillian had walked through his gate, 15 months ago now, with her worn leather bag and her sage-colored dress and her green eyes that measured everything and apologized for nothing. He thought about how he had stood there holding a branding iron and lost his own name. He thought about the coffee mornings and the snow days and the fire in the main room and the kiss beside the kitchen stove and the church in Mescalero with desert flowers and the blue dress she had made herself. He thought about the water dispute and Domingo's barely concealed delight and Thomas learning to read, and the way the ranch house had felt different the moment she came into it, inhabited rather than merely occupied. He had built this ranch from his father's work and his own, built it with years of effort and care, and he had thought for a long time that the ranch was the thing he was most proud of, the thing that defined him, Calvin Sheridan of New Mexico Territory. He understood now that the ranch was only part of it, that you could build something out of land and labor that was real and lasting and worth building, but that a life required more than that to be full, required someone to share the seeing of it, someone whose mind and heart ran alongside yours, someone whose presence made the dark-eyed mountains and the extraordinary sunsets and the first call of the mockingbirds in the morning mean something beyond their own beautiful factual existence. He turned his head and looked at Lillian sleeping beside him, her dark auburn hair loose on the pillow, her face relaxed in a way it almost never quite was when she was awake, all the careful management set aside in sleep and the pure reality of her visible underneath it. He thought that she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in 32 years of encountering people, and that he would spend whatever years remained to him making sure she understood that. He closed his eyes, and the mockingbird sang somewhere in the dark outside, and Henry slept soundly in his crib, and the ranch was quiet around them all. The summer of 1875 was one of the good ones. The rains came at the right intervals, which in the Chihuahuan desert is a matter of some significance, and the pastures stayed green longer than usual. The calf crop from the expanded herd was strong, and Calvin's account books at the end of the season showed the best year the ranch had produced. He made sure that Domingo and the ranch hands all received a bonus at the end of the season, which Domingo accepted with the gracious dignity of a man who has worked hard and knows it. Thomas, who had been growing in competence and confidence throughout the year, came to Calvin in September with his hat in his hands and a clear-eyed seriousness that reminded Calvin of his own younger self, and said that he had been offered a position managing a small ranch for a widow woman in the next valley who needed a reliable man and could not afford to hire someone experienced, and that he wanted Calvin's opinion about whether he should take it. Calvin listened to the whole presentation and then was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to take it?" he asked. "I think so," Thomas said. "It is less pay and it is smaller, but it would be mine to manage." "Take it," Calvin said. A man learns differently when the responsibility is fully his. Thomas nodded, looking relieved and also slightly terrified, which was the right combination for someone about to take a significant step. He worked out his remaining 2 weeks and left on a Monday morning with his horse and his belongings and the weekly newspaper tucked under his arm and shook Calvin's hand, and then, with a touching formality, shook Lillian's hand as well. "You taught me a great deal more than reading," he told her. She looked at him steadily. "You taught yourself," she said. "I just sat in the same room." He rode out down the road and they watched him go from the porch, Calvin's arm around Lillian's shoulders and Henry on her hip, and it was a good feeling to watch him go, the specific pride of seeing someone better for having been near you. They hired a new ranch hand named Felipe, who was 23 and experienced and quieter than Thomas, but equally honest. The ranch settled into its new rhythm, and the year completed itself and gave way to winter again. In December, the second Christmas of their marriage, Lillian found the journal he had been writing in since she gave it to him the year before. She had not been looking for it. It had simply slipped from the shelf where he kept it and fallen open on the desk, and she had picked it up and seen a page that her own name was on, and read it. He came in and found her reading it. He would have been within his rights to be bothered by this, as journals are private things, but what she had opened to was not private in the way that things are private when they hold darkness. It was private in the way that deeply felt things are private, because they are important and because expressing them makes you vulnerable. She had read about herself, about how he had seen her and what he thought and how she made him feel. She looked up when he came in and she was not embarrassed and she did not pretend she had not been reading it because those kinds of small dishonesties were not in her character. "I was not looking for it," she said. "I know," he said. "Calvin." She looked at the open page and then back at him. "You have not told me these things." "I know," he said again. She looked at him with those green eyes that missed nothing. "You should tell me these things." He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside the desk, and looked at her with the full, direct attention she had learned was how he expressed his deepest feelings, when words were not yet fully organized. "You are the best thing that has ever come into my life," he said. "I know that is not an elegant way to say it, and if I were a different kind of man I would find better words. But it is the truest thing I can tell you, and I would rather say it plainly than say it beautifully and have it be less than what it is." She set the journal down carefully and looked at him for a long, complete moment, and then she leaned forward and kissed him with a tenderness that held all the months of their life together in it. The coffee mornings and the hard days and the good evenings, and Henry sleeping in his crib, and the endless turning of the New Mexico seasons around their shared life. "That was very elegant," she said when she sat back. "Was it?" He looked genuinely uncertain. "Yes," she said, "because it was true." The winter passed, and with it the first year of Henry's life, which contained the full range of developmental milestones and parental discoveries, and the spring of 1876 came in warm and promising. Henry was walking by March, which he did with the enthusiastic incompetence of a very new walker, and by April he had developed strong opinions about everything, which he communicated with a volume and conviction that seemed to both of his parents to be entirely in character for someone who was the combined product of Calvin Sheridan and Lillian Maddox. Eduardo and Rosa Martinez came to the ranch for supper in May, as they had taken to doing periodically, and Rosa held Henry on her lap and told Lillian, in the way that experienced mothers tell new ones things, that the second one was easier in some ways and harder in others. Lillian raised an eyebrow at this intelligence and looked across the table at Calvin, who returned the look with the particular expression of a man who is entirely open to whatever the future brings. There was a second child. She arrived in February of 1877, a girl this time, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and it seemed immediately apparent, her mother's quiet and comprehensive assessment of everything around her. They named her Clara, after Lillian's mother, who was still living in St. Joseph, and who received a letter about her granddaughter's arrival with a response so full of emotion that it used up 2 full sheets of paper, and still seemed to have more to say. Calvin held Clara the way he had held Henry, with the same careful reverence, but there was something additionally careful in it this time, some extra quality of attention, as though he were trying to communicate something through the holding that was larger than holding. "She is going to be trouble," Domingo said affectionately when he saw her for the first time. "Look at those eyes. She is already thinking about something." "She is 3 days old," Calvin pointed out. "Good thinking starts early," Domingo said serenely. The ranch in the spring of 1877 was a different place from the one Lillian had walked through 4 years prior. The house had been extended to accommodate the growing family, with a proper nursery and a room that had been turned into a study where Lillian kept her books and the ranch accounts. The kitchen garden had expanded to a proper kitchen garden, organized and productive, that provided herbs and vegetables through a significant portion of the year. The herd was larger and the property was well maintained, and Domingo had a young assistant now, a capable young man named Rodrigo who showed real promise. Calvin stood at the gate of his property one morning in April, doing an inspection of the gate's hinges, which needed replacing, and looked out at the road and then back at his ranch, and thought about the morning a woman had walked through it with a leather bag and a worn hat, and a letter he had not answered. He thought about losing his own name and finding something considerably more valuable in the transaction. He thought about all the ways a life can change direction in a single morning, when the gate swings open and the right person steps through. Lillian came out of the house with Henry on her hand, who was now a determined and opinionated 3-year-old, and Clara on her hip, and she was saying something to Henry that was making him laugh, and the sound of it traveled across the yard to where Calvin was standing, and the mountains were behind them both, sharp and permanent and extraordinary in the April light, and the mockingbirds were singing in the mesquite near the kitchen garden, and the whole scene had the quality that the best moments have. The quality of being absolutely what it is, unrepeatable and complete. She looked across the yard and saw him standing at the gate looking at her, and she raised an eyebrow in the way she did when she wanted to know what he was thinking. He walked toward her across the yard. Henry detached himself from his mother's hand and ran toward his father with the vigorous confidence of a child who has never not been caught, and Calvin swooped him up and settled him on his arm and reached Lillian and kissed her on the forehead. "What were you doing at the gate?" she asked. "Hinges need replacing," he said. "Is that all you were doing?" He looked at her. "No," he said. She waited. "I was thinking about the morning you came through it," he said. "The first morning." Her expression changed, softened, gained the particular quality it had when she was feeling something she was still deciding whether to fully show. "What were you thinking about it?" "I was thinking that I did not know my own name when you came through that gate," he said, "and that I have not been particularly concerned about knowing it since, because what I know instead seems considerably more important." She looked at him for a moment, and Henry looked between them with the interested attention of a child who has learned that when his parents look at each other like this, something real is happening. "Calvin Sheridan," she said. "You have your name exactly right." He smiled at her, that smile that Domingo had once said appeared as rarely as July snow, but which appeared considerably more frequently now, which Domingo noted with great personal satisfaction. "I do," he agreed. "I have everything exactly right." She reached up and touched his face with one hand, the kind of touch that is not a gesture but a statement, and the mountains were behind them both, and the desert was coming alive in the April warmth, and Henry was patting Calvin's hat with the proprietorial manner of a boy who considers his father's hat to be a public resource, and Clara had fallen asleep on Lillian's hip with the peaceful confidence of a person who knows perfectly well that the world is a safe place. The ranch hands were beginning their morning work, and the horses were moving in the corral, and the day was opening up around them with all its demands and its pleasures. And later, there would be accounts to review and horses to work, and a fence line in the north pasture that needed attention, and a letter to write to Lillian's mother in Missouri, and the evening meal to plan and Henry to put to bed with a story, and all the thousand things that made up the fabric of this life they had built together. But in this moment, standing in the yard of the ranch he had inherited and transformed and loved, and nearly lost himself in before he found something more important to be than just the man who owned it, Calvin Sheridan held his son and stood beside his wife, and felt the particular fullness of a life that has stopped being a performance of itself, and become instead exactly and genuinely what it is. Lillian looked at him once more in the way she had always looked at him, with those green eyes that missed nothing and apologized for nothing, and he looked back at her with his full, steady, dark-eyed attention, and the New Mexico morning moved around them both, and the gate that she had walked through 4 years ago stood open behind him, swinging slightly in the warm spring wind, as though it was still telling the story of the morning everything changed. Domingo came out of the barn and saw them standing there and turned around and went back inside with an expression of profound satisfaction and said nothing, because there are some things that do not need commentary, and this was one of them. The ranch went on. The seasons came in their order. The herd grew and the children grew, and the mountains stayed exactly where they had always been. Thomas came back to visit in the fall, looking older and more confident, the owner now of his own small operation, with a woman beside him he introduced as Ruth, who looked at him the way Lillian looked at Calvin, which told everyone everything important about her. They sat around the table in the ranch house that had been expanded and made warm by years of deliberate living, and they ate the meal Lillian had made and drank the coffee that was always good in that house. And Henry sat next to Thomas and peppered him with questions about his ranch, with the focused curiosity of a child who has grown up understanding that ranching is serious and interesting and important. And Thomas answered every question with the patience of someone who remembers being taught with patience and understands its value. Calvin watched it all from his end of the table. He watched Lillian and Ruth find their footing with each other in the way that good women do, directly and with humor. He watched Henry's questions and Thomas's patient answering. He watched Domingo accept a second piece of pie with the dignified gratitude of a man who has earned his dessert many times over. He watched Clara sleeping in her chair, because Clara could sleep through anything, a talent that her parents found both baffling and deeply enviable. He looked at Lillian across the table. She looked back at him. 4 years of mornings and evenings and hard days and good ones passed between them in that look, and the warmth of the room held them all. And outside, the October stars were doing what the New Mexico stars do in October, which is to make the sky look like something that was specifically constructed to be beautiful. Later, after Thomas and Ruth had taken their leave and the children were in bed, and the ranch hands were in the bunkhouse and Domingo had gone to his own small house at the edge of the property, Calvin and Lillian sat on the porch in the cool October, ere the way they had sat on that porch across 4 years of evenings. And the stars were exceptional, and the mountains were dark shapes against a dark sky, and the desert was making its subtle nighttime sounds. "We should invite Thomas and Ruth for Christmas," Lillian said. "Yes," Calvin said, "we should. He looked well. He did. He turned out to be a good man." "He always was," she said. "He just needed time to know it." Calvin looked at the stars. "Like most people," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did in the evenings when the day had been complete, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the dark with the stars overhead and the ranch quiet around them and the whole architecture of their shared life solid and warm and real. This was the thing he had not known how to want before he knew what to want. This exact thing. Not just the land and the cattle and the successful books and the good reputation, but this, the presence of someone beside you who has chosen you completely and whom you have chosen completely in return, and the days you build together that are real because you have both lived every minute of them fully, and the children who are the living evidence of the fact that some things you make together are more than the sum of what either of you could make alone. He had been the toughest rancher in New Mexico, and he still was, in the sense that the land was still hard and the work was still hard, and the desert still required everything you had, and then asked for more. But tough, he had learned, was not the same thing as strong, and strong was not the same thing as whole, and he had not been whole, not in the deepest sense, until the morning he stood at his own gate with a branding iron in his hand and lost his name and found his life. She breathed slowly beside him in the October dark, her head on his shoulder, and the stars wheeled slowly above the ranch, and the mountains held their ancient positions on the horizon, and Henry would be walking and talking and asking relentless questions tomorrow morning, and Clara would sleep late as she always did and wake in a good mood that neither parent could account for but both were grateful for. And there was a fence line in the north pasture that wanted attention and a letter from Alcott about a grazing lease that wanted a response, and all the days ahead were full of the demanding and the beautiful in the specific mixture that this life on this land in this part of the world had always offered. Calvin Sheridan pulled Lillian closer and looked at the stars over New Mexico and felt, in the deep and quiet center of himself, the settled and complete feeling of a man who has exactly what he has and knows it, and would not trade it for anything the world has to offer or could ever devise. The gate stood open in the dark at the edge of the yard, as it often did in the evening before someone remembered to close it. The iron hinges Calvin had replaced in April doing their quiet work, the wood worn smooth by years of use. Tomorrow someone would close it in the morning, and tomorrow evening it might be open again, because gates on working ranches are opened and closed many times in a day, by hands that are doing the work of living. And some mornings, sometimes, when the light was right and the world was just beginning and the mockingbirds were starting up in the mesquite, it was possible to stand at that gate and feel the whole shape of what a life can be, when the right person comes through it.